Welcome to our latest very special episode in our speaker series on innovators and entrepreneurs. Thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it. We've got a good mix of students, faculty, alumni. My name is Aaron Gard. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Innovation at the School of Law, where our focus is the intersection of law, business, and innovation. And as we see often, the bigger, more complex the new technology or innovation is, the more likely it is that law and regulation are going to lag behind. That's something we always see. So that means that ethical considerations will always come into play. So with that said, I can't think of a better speaker to have than our friend Reggie Townsend from SAS. So thanks to Reggie for being here. So Reggie is the Vice President of the SAS AI Ethics, Governance, and Social Impact Division. His title keeps getting longer as things keep getting more complex. I just confirmed that with him before we started. So they owe him probably more money. Where he spearheads a global responsible innovation initiative to develop strategies for implementing data-driven systems that promote human-centric technology practices. His office offers a range of services, including advisory support, product strategy, and thought leadership. In 2022, Reggie was appointed by the U.S. Department of Commerce to the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee. The NAIAC provides guidance to the White House and the National AI Innovation Office on various AI-related issues. He also serves on the board of Equal AI, a nonprofit dedicated to working with companies, policymakers, and experts to reduce harms associated with AI. Prior to leading his current office at SAS, Reggie led cloud consulting and managed services engagements for healthcare and life sciences sectors. With experience in strategic planning, program management, consulting, and business development, he has a deep understanding of advanced analytics, cloud computing, and AI. His extensive experience spans multiple industries and sectors where AI is increasingly utilized, and he's passionate about equity and human empowerment. In 2021, he received the SAS CEO Award of Excellence, the company's highest employee honor, and he's recognized as an exceptional employee with core values. He's an inspiring speaker and presenter. I've heard him speak before. He's very, very impressive. He's appeared on stage globally from South by Southwest to Singapore, and his insights are routinely sought after by journalists around the world. He holds a bachelor's degree in electronics engineering from Southern Illinois University and an MBA from the Illinois Institute of Technology. I'm thrilled to have Reggie with us today. Reggie, thank you so much.
Of course, thank you. Appreciate it. By all means, eat, right? That's probably the most important thing you'll do during this time together. I used to teach adjunct at a community college back in Chicagoland, and it was evenings. And I would always tell my students, yeah, we need to come and learn, but I get it. It's hard to learn if the stomach is rumbling, so bring your food in or whatever. Just don't have a Big Mac attack, right? Just everybody just eat with your mouth closed. So I'll extend that to you all as well. Thank you, Dean Hessick, for having me, Aaron, for helping pull this together. I know we played around with different dates and times, and we finally figured it out. The travel schedule can be sometimes a bit of a bear, but we figured it out, so I'm happy for that. Melissa for helping the coordination, and whoever bought all the Chick-fil-A, shout out to you. That is super cool. So I understand that Tar Heels have a game tonight somewhere around 6:50 is my understanding. So you all are really lucky because I'm only going to talk for about 5 hours. So we got plenty of time to make it to the bars. No, but seriously, I want to talk a little bit about not just AI. I mean, I think, so show of hands, how many people know how to spell AI at this point? Okay, good. So we're at least locked in there. I'll talk a little bit about AI, but as the expanding title that Aaron pointed out would indicate, there's a lot more to the AI conversation than just the technology. There certainly is the ethical component. There's the governance component to be concerned with as well. And perhaps even most importantly out of all of that is the social impact component. right? And so, as we were playing around with what the new division name would be, I almost abstracted away all of the terms and just said something just really benign, but I thought it would be really benign and it would hit that way. And I think it's important that we, at this point in the AI conversation, still be very deliberate with understanding how it intersects with the ethics, with the governance structures that we put in place, and certainly with society. So with that, I want to just start with a question for all of us. We just came out of Oscar season. Did your favorite Best Picture win? Some people were like all in for Sinner. Some people were all in for one battle after another. So in my house, so by the way, I was supposed to fly here to North Carolina on Sunday. I couldn't because we have all sorts of storms and whatnot in Chicago. So it actually was a good thing for me because in my house, my wife is an Oscars movie nut. And so I spend the back half of most years and the front part of the next years looking at Oscar stuff, right? And, reading a lot of international movies that, I would probably much rather have a nap. But be that as it may, I was able to stick around. And so I'm still very much in movie and storytelling mode as a consequence. All right, so bear with me because I want to talk today really about story. And I want to ask, what story are we telling ourselves right now about AI? Right? What story are we telling about AI? Because the truth is, we don't live inside of technologies. We don't live inside of laws and legal structures. I would argue that we live inside of stories. And those stories help us understand who we are. They help us understand what's possible. They fortify, oftentimes, through things like laws, who we choose to become, who we choose to include, and who we choose to exclude, and how we plan to do that. And right now, I think that we are surrounded by a few competing stories with respect to AI. And so I want to open up those stories because right now some of them are exciting us. We're super all in, some of us. Some of us are a touch frightened. And I get that. AI anxiety is a very real thing. Some of us are just flat out confused. Like, what did you just say? I don't quite understand how that matters to me and why it should. But it's undeniable that all of them are having an impact on our future. And so I just want to unpack what I think are some of the key stories. And I want to name them. And I want to offer a better story if I can. One that I think would be a little more compelling, one that I think is much more rooted in dignity, much more rooted in purpose. And again, my point of view, just one man's point of view, I think the story that is much more worthy of us all. So let's talk about first how stories shape culture, right? Because really, if you take the ethics and the governance and the social impact and weave it together in story, what you've effectively created is what we refer to as culture, right? Culture is really effectively built around a common story. And sometimes they entertain us, sometimes they don't. But it's undeniable that these stories, this culture, right, is part of the architecture that keeps us all together. So when we have things like, this election was fake. No, it wasn't, right? It pulls apart from culture, right? And so what are here in the US anyway, the culture war is all about is trying to define the story that will propel us into the next 250 years, right? Stories help make us brave, right? We need to go and tackle that hill. Stories can also make us small, like I deserve to be abused, right? Those sorts of things. Like these are all parts of, I would argue, mental conditioning. If you think about the American dream for a second, For generations, it shaped how we worked, how we hoped, how we sacrificed, right? And that whole dream was about, I'm going to do X, and my next generation is going to do X plus, and the next generation is going to do X plus plus. But today, only 50% of Americans born in 1980 and beyond can say that they're actually going to do better than their parents did, all right? Now, you can compare that to 1940 when 92% of children would be able to say that. But has the story changed? I would argue no. The story still exists, even though the underlying data to support the story has in fact changed, right? And we have to wrestle with that. This right now is the power of narrative. This is the power of all of the Oscars movies, right? It's what story are we attempting to extend into society? And it's not just about what we think, but again, it really turns into what we become. And so if we want culture to evolve, I believe that we've got to make sure it evolves wisely, right? We got to bake sufficient wisdom into culture, and we've got to look really closely at the stories that we tell as a result. So let me walk you through what I see as the three storylines with respect to AI. All right, so I'm going to give you my movie voice for a second, all right? This is the story of acceleration. And the way it would go, if you were at the movie theaters seeing the previews, it would be a big A with a cape on it, you know, blowing, sort of like Beyonce. And it would be like, AI, because we can. That would be it, right? Now, this is the story of breakthrough. This is the story that celebrates invention and going super fast and disrupting and being first, right? That is a prevalent story vis-a-vis AI today. And there's a lot of beauty in that story, I believe, as well. It is beautiful because it gives us tools that increases things like productivity. It's beautiful because it gives us things like expanded human capability, right? Big A on the chest. But the thing is, speed alone doesn't carry the day. And speed carries a cost to it, if just on its own. So right now, a lot of companies are moving fast to adopt AI, but 75% of employees who are using AI inside of corporations are kind of winging it, right? Over half of them are saying that they're figuring it out as they go, right? Friday, I left for the weekend, and Monday I came back and Copilot was on my desk. What do I do? I don't know, figure it out, right? That's really actually happening right now in corporate America. The tools, however, they're advancing very quickly. They're advancing much faster, I would argue, than the people's ability to rely on them, right? Seems like every other month we hear about a new version of ChatGPT that now can wash our clothes and, you know, do our dry cleaning, right? But last week it could only do, you know, half of that. So these workers that are using AI right now, they're 2 times more likely as a result of all of these changes to suggest that they're stressed, right? So when we're talking about that AI anxiety, right? It's in large part because things are moving more quickly than people are able to absorb the movement. And that explains why some of that confusion is taking root right now, all right? So think about it this way. The acceleration story and its storytellers, right? It's important to know who benefits from what story and why they might choose to continue to lean more into one story versus another. There are storytellers like the big foundation model providers that will tell us very earnestly that AI is about to wipe away half of entry-level white-collar jobs. So some of you students who are becoming lawyers actively, right? They're saying, 50% of you, forget about it, right? I would say that it's the equivalent of being on the tracks of a runaway train, except the train is AI, right? There are other CEOs who are warning us about these dire consequences of runaway AI, and it's funny because it's a train that they're actually driving, right? It's like, dude, if it's so problematic, why don't you stop? They urge us that we've got to use it or we're going to get left behind, right? You have no choice in the matter. You have to take what we're giving you. And that creates a very awkward tension, doesn't it? Right? What am I supposed to do with that? But the reality is, yes, there is a train coming. I want to be frank with you. It's for the 50% of you. Like, there is a train coming. I don't know how fast it's moving. Neither, by the way, do the people who are claiming all this stuff. Right? I don't know whether we'll be able to stop it. Just being honest with you. But it won't be because it is embodied and doing its own thing. These are all choices, right? These are human choices. And the thing is, we get an opportunity to steer the train. We cannot allow the train to simply be steered by those who have the greatest to benefit, right? So that's the acceleration story. Next story is the transformation story. This is, so if the last story was kind of the Avengers, this would be, what's the movie where you say, oh, you gotta go do it for the Gipper. I know it's hard, but do it for the Gipper. This is a story of transformation. This is the coming of age story. This is the coming soon to a theater near you, AI, because we should, right? Now, this is the hopeful story. This is the one that says that AI can reflect our highest ideals. It will help us become who we were meant to be. None of us were intended to actually work. We were intended to lay on the beach and write poetry, right? But it is intended to inspire this story, to inspire us to design for things like accessibility, for fairness, for inclusion, for that ultimate kumbaya moment that we're all destined for as humanity. Right? Don't you see it? AI is going to bring that to us. But we do see some evidence. Right? I don't want to be too flippant about this. There is some evidence. So a recent study revealed that 91% of employees in corporations who are neurodivergent say that AI actually helps them to thrive in their roles, right? Because of the multimodal capabilities. If you're low sight or sightless, the ability to talk to your computing device is a game changer. Right? The ability to put on some glasses, some meta glasses, if you're low sight and get directions. Right? I mean, there are people out running marathons now who previously weren't able to cross streets well. That's awesome. AI-enabled accessibility tools support over 1 million people globally with disabilities. So think about bringing people from the margins and into, right, the whole of the economy, the whole of society. That is game changing, and we ought to applaud the efforts. But that is AI, in my opinion, at its best, when it is helping humanity be human. Right? This is the expansion of human dignity, as I refer to it. But as inspiring as that is, there's also a challenge here. And you'll start to see a theme. There's kind of the heads and the tails. good intentions weaken under pressure, right? And so when there is an attempt to do what is most hopeful, most inspiring, most dignifying, that comes against the pressures of meeting the quarter's economic expectations. Oftentimes we see, teams that are focused on accessibility, teams that are focused on like ethics and governance take a back seat. Now, of course, that's not happening at SAS, I'm happy to say. Again, my remit is expanding. But I can't say that for all firms, unfortunately. Right? We're going to disband it and disperse it throughout the rest of the company. We don't need as much of a centralized focus on it. We're going to make sure that everyone does the right thing. Right? How's that working out for us? I think transformation is the right aspiration, but aspiration alone does not make a strategy. And companies need strategies. No single company can be omnipotent in this space either, right? We need strategies that go across companies, academia, government, because AI is a diffuse technology, much like electricity, right? We don't just have one electrical company that makes all decisions for electricity and disperses accordingly. No, we have an electrical company that does all the transformation work, and then it has its own watchdogs, and it's got its government regulators, and so on and so forth, right? And so I expect that in the world of AI, we'll end up having to have some sort of similar structure. Third story. Third story is the story of caution. So if the first one was the Avengers, the second story we're going to do it for the Gipper, and I realize I'm dating myself for some of the students who might not understand that reference. That's okay. Just call me Uncle Reg here. The third story is more like, give me a horror story, Freddy Krueger or somebody like that, right? It's the story of caution, like, don't do it because it's risky, right? Stop. That's that caution story. Tells us to be careful. Tells us that power without accountability can cause harm. It can be reckless. And they're not wrong, right? This is the story that urges us to think about things like bias, how we might erode privacy, the emotional toll, and the cognitive atrophy associated with AI and automation, right? And for good reason. 83% of audited AI hiring tools, right, to determine whether or not you're going to get your next job, have measurable demographic bias, statistically relevant. Deepfakes projected to be 20% of all online traffic this year. Right? That was a punch in the gut, right? So the folks that are telling us to be cautious, they're not wrong in this. They are, I think, absolutely right to raise concerns, but because they recognize that risk that is ignored becomes harm that is endured, right? And so they've got to call it out. But, and this is that heads and tails, caution alone has its own weakness too, right? If all we do is run away and avoid danger, then we never innovate and we never genuinely help, right? But as is the case in so many of the stories in culture today is, I need to, as the kids say, my son, 10 toes down right here on this thing, right? And It doesn't matter what you say and how you say it and who you say it to. I'm 10 toes down right here. And it creates a lot of binary mechanics in our narratives, right? And that tends to be, I think, very problematic. So the challenge that we have here is to recognize that each of these stories all contain some measure of wisdom. They all contain some measure of truth. But together, they pull us in these disparate directions. One tells us to move faster. One tells us to move thoughtfully. The other says to don't move at all, right? So I don't think that this is a problem insofar as it being new. I think humans have always had different ways of viewing the world. I think we can certainly argue that our views tend to get amplified today. They tend to be dispersed rapidly today. All right. There used to be a time when you would get all of your stories at the 5 o'clock news hour, right? 3 channels of information. There was an upside to that. There's a downside to that kind of consolidation as well, right? Now, we fast forward so many years, we all have a channel in our pockets right now. We can just fire it out literally around the world, right? Here is my take. And there's something that seems to be about the human condition where we all want to have a hot take. Let me fire this off before I make it to my next class and let the world know where I stand on things. And you just never know which of those points of view become what we call now viral and turn into another little subplot in the story, right? Whether it be for good or not, right? So this is where we are. This is just the conditioning that we have, or condition, the situation that we have to deal with. All of that said, I promise you what I think might be a slightly better story. I'll let you be the judge, though. All right, so here we go. Ready? All right, here we go. All right, let me wipe the smile off my face. This is serious business. All right. Coming soon to a theater near you. This is Oscar worthy, by the way. All right. I'm getting my left side because I think that's the better side. All right. Coming soon to a theater near you. AI should help to reduce human suffering. All right, I gotta workshop the whole dramatic pause and all that stuff. But AI for the purpose of reducing human suffering. Just let that sit with you for a second. And maybe we should just say AI because it helps. No, I'm not attempting to sound noble here. I'm attempting to be extremely pragmatic. Because one thing that I think we can all attest to is that the idea of suffering is universal. I think we all understand viscerally what suffering is. Every single one of us, no matter whether you're an accelerationist or, someone who wants to slow things down, we all understand suffering on some real human level, right? When we judge technology by its impact on our suffering, I think we have an opportunity to change the conversation. And importantly, we have an opportunity to meet somewhere closer to the middle. Right? And I know, again, it's not in vogue today to not be 10 toes down, but I'm saying, all right, keep 5 toes down and maybe take us half a step in the other direction to try to meet somewhere in the middle. Because I think when we start to question about degrees of suffering, the questions that we ask about whether we should or shouldn't get a lot more clear. And I think so do our choices. So, for an example, if we just ask the question, does this AI, fill in the blank, chatbot, fraud detection system, hiring system, etc., does this AI reduce suffering or add to it? feels like a binary that we can all at least start to talk about from some informed point of view. And I think if we also started with this idea of, does this AI cause suffering, not just to me, but perhaps to those who are most vulnerable and potentially those who are most greatly impacted by this AI, does it increase their suffering? That also gives us a much more clear view about how to pursue the application of the AI. So I don't really see this so much as compromise in the conversation. I really see it as a way of aligning all of these disparate interests. So I happen to believe that you can do good for people and do well for yourself. In other words, you can make money and do good. You can make money and reduce suffering. The two are not antithetical, right? So where can we actively think about reducing suffering right now? Because there's actual places we can do that. We don't have to wait for some new model in 2028 to reduce suffering today, because again, we all understand that suffering exists today in some way, shape, or form. There are ways that AI is introducing suffering or harm, where I think leaders can step up and do something about it today. Areas like exclusion, who's in the conversation and who's not, who's getting unequal access to training and who isn't, right? Those sorts of things. Bias, again, I talked about the automated hiring tools. Who's being biased against, who's being preferred. We can have those conversations. And at the end of the day, all this AI stuff turns into mathematics. Mathematically, we can determine bias socially, legally, and otherwise. We have now the obligation with that mathematics to do something about it, right? Surveillance stress. Is the AI monitoring me? Is the AI managing me? We can do something about that now. Again, these are human choices. It's not the big bad AI like Godzilla coming across the town. These are choices that we get to make. Broken promises. The AI is going to show up and it's going to take away all of your woes. Well, we should probably stop saying some things. And I'm talking to us as technology leaders. Close your mouth, man. I know, there's one thing to go out and try to raise billions of dollars so that you can build your data centers and your next models and try to get people pumped up, but you should probably pump the brakes before you start going out into broader society and making certain claims that then don't come true, that then threaten your credibility for the next time that you open your mouth, right? Stories hold up because truth exists. And if you can't have truth, your story's going to fall apart. All right. This isn't unprecedented. Anything I'm talking about. I think there's precedent in history that we can look back to inform ourselves as to the way to best orchestrate ourselves vis-a-vis this new-ish technology, shall we say. All right. 1982, Johnson & Johnson. And there's a reason I'm going all the way back to 1982. You'll find out in a minute. They recalled 31 million bottles of Tylenol during a national crisis. Now, some of y'all are old enough to remember that, right? It was a big deal. Like, you can't open the Tylenol because it's going to be laced with cyanide. It's going to kill you, right? That was a big deal at that time. They accepted the short-term cost to protect human life. In fact, I would argue they had no choice, right? Had they kept the Tylenol on shelves, that would have been the going out of business strategy for Johnson & Johnson. They had to pull back. So, but given the benefit of the doubt, they chose transparency. They chose responsibility in that particular case. And because they did, eventually the public trusted them again. Their market share eventually recovered, and their reputation grew. Samsung phones, Galaxy 7 back in the day, they had to recall 2.5 million of their devices that had problematic batteries. Quarterly profits dropped 30%. They took immediate action though. They, kind of very, very Japanese of them, and it's not a derogatory at all. There's a respectful term. Like, they're like, okay, that's a problem, we're gonna do something about it, and they got really tactical about it. They were radically transparent at the time, sharing, hey, here's what's going on, here's what's not going on, here's what we found, here's what we haven't found yet. They eventually redesigned their whole battery safety system, and that became a standard for the industry as a consequence. So I tend to think that's a timeless lesson for us. When leaders put human well-being at the center, eventually they recover, right? Because there's something about us that wants to almost, I don't want to just say forgive, but wants to trust. Like it's hard to walk around society not trusting, right? Now, that said, I was going to get back to why I had to reach so far back in the annals for these examples. So I'm on my AI chatbot. I'm like, what about this? I look for more examples of positive stories of corporations actively building trust so they can tell a story that is more unifying, that is about reducing human suffering, et cetera, et cetera. I use multiple models, Claude, GPT, Gemini, and they all came back with the same stuff. A total of 5. 5 of these stories. Then I said, all right, let's look at the flip side of this. If that's the heads, let's look at the tails. And let's contrast this example with where we prioritize profit over people. And let's see what I get back. The AI stopped at 15 and said, would you like more? Because there are dozens more. In the crisis management literature, like the business schools people study, and you all might see some of this stuff as well, there is one example that is cited as the standard for kind of stepping out with management courage and you name it, from 1982, and that was the Johnson & Johnson example. It's still in business books today as the standard. One example, 44 years ago. Okay. That's how rare it is for companies to prioritize safety and transparency over quarterly earnings. Which means that for every Samsung that helps to rebuild trust, you've got a Boeing that's going to delay and deny and obfuscate and you name it. 5 times. If we're going to rely on the storytellers, the AI storytellers, to do what is in our best interest, history would tell us that that's a fool's errand. Which means that it's up to us to make sure that our part of the story is told, right? That our interest is expressed. Now, however we do that, there's establishment of curricula, through legislative processes, through corporate leadership. We've got to make sure collectively that the story is much more reflective of a panorama a global panorama, by the way, right? Because right now the stories, even those three that I talked about, are largely the stories being driven out of the United States, China, and a portion of Europe. That's it. There's a big globe out there, y'all, right? And so we've got to figure out a way to get more of our stories told, because the stories that we tell, again, will dictate who we become. And if we want a future with this AI stuff that is worthy of actually experiencing, if we want a future where training is accessible, where bias shrinks or is diminished, where workers feel supported, where innovation doesn't frighten the heck out of us, when this train is coming and we feel like it's going to run us over because we have no choice in the matter, then that means we've got to do something different as it relates to contributing to the story. And again, I don't think this is idealism that I'm talking about. This is pragmatism. This is a conversation about design, right? That's really what governance is in my part of the world, right? We're designing governance structures that comport with the story that we would like to have told so that we can embody the future that we prefer, right? And we're going to scale our judgment along the way. So this is also about leadership. Look, no shade to my Silicon bros, my tech. But if this is all about grift and how you can make the next billion, I need you to close your mouth, right? Go hang out with your private equity people, make your money. I got no problem with that. But when you start talking about how your science fiction view of the world is going to affect me and mine, that's when we start to have a problem. And I think what a lot of people are feeling right now, and 40% of people in the United States reject, just flat out reject AI just on the term alone, right? Because there's so many messages and signals that we get in this conversation that make people, to turn people off, right? And when you press people, they're not really turned off about the capability. I have the great pleasure of traveling a lot, which means that I talk to a lot of Uber drivers, right? And when they find out what I do, of course, I want to have a conversation. And within 2 minutes' time, I get some kind of fear-based response. But when I press them and say, well, what about this and what about that? The capabilities sound super cool, but I can't quite trust the people who are selling this stuff, because I get that a hammer can hit a nail and a windshield. I get that, people aren't stupid, but I can't quite trust that these people have my best interests at heart, is what I eventually get down to. So we've got to be leaders in this space. And if those folks aren't prepared to truly lead with this kind of power that they've accrued, then I much prefer to sit to the side and let people who are prepared to lead on a grander scale to lead. But at the end of the day, this is about us. This is about the story that we tell. This is about our culture and the next story that we choose to tell. So I'm going to end where I began. I know I promised you 5 hours, but I won't do the whole 5. What story are we telling about AI? What story are you, as an individual, telling about AI? We can choose the story of speed if we want. We can choose the story of hope. We can choose the story of caution. But the story that carries us forward, I think, is the story that centers people. And it's the story that reduces suffering. Culture is shaped by the stories we tell one another. So I'm going to pause it there. Again, I apologize for not giving you the next 4 hours, but I'll pause it there and allow us, please, to dialogue around the topic. I've got a little bit of time before I have to catch a plane. So, Aaron, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Well, first off, that was amazing, and I don't know, the kind of speech I don't often hear, that where the room is so quiet because everyone is really being home. So thank you. Does anyone, while we have Reggie here, have some thoughtful questions, especially in our space of the law, where we have folks on both sides? We have folks who help innovators who will want to advance, but we also have folks who think it's regulation and slowing things down and protecting others. So I think when I graduated law school, my dad gave me a coffee cup and said, the law profession, like the only place where you're trained to defend yourself from your own kind. And I was like, ha ha ha. But does anyone have some thoughts for Reggie or questions while we have him here?
Yeah. And they don't have to be fully prepared and baked, just something that's intuitively come out. Let it out. Thank you for your question. It doesn't matter. Absolutely, it matters. Let's double click on leaders, because not all leaders are the same. You have people who lead from a political perspective who theoretically have a purpose in the political spectrum of community service, doing what's in the best interest, da-da-da-da-da-da. You have leaders in academia who provide a different kind of service, imparting knowledge for the purpose of having a more well-rounded society, informed, da-da-da-da-da-da. You have leaders in nonprofit spaces who are emboldened to go out and find those people who are on the margins, usually for a particular segment, demographic, etc. They've got their marching orders. You've got corporate. So we all profit, we sometimes profit. Is that all we care about? And if so, where does that logically end, and that sort of thing? So you've got this cacophony, right? Let's call it a symphony of contributors to this chorus that we refer to as society. And I think it's important to allow each of those to be propelled by their own purpose. However, there's a recognition that at some point we all have to come together. And so what happens when all of those different segments of society are on the same accelerationist story, is what you're saying? Does that matter? The answer is absolutely, it has to. Because if you can convince the political people that, don't worry about, I know we said 2 years ago that, this is something that we built that was going to kill everybody. Forget everything we said, right? Now what we really care about is you building more data centers so we can get more data. And yeah, I know we're going to make a couple $1 billion, but don't worry about that part. We're just trying to do this because we have realized that we can actually do some significant good in the world. And oh, by the way, if we don't do it, then all the other people will. So if you can convince them, and then you convince the rest of the corporates that, hey, you know what, guys, we're going to eat your lunch. We're going to just take over everything that you do. I don't know if anybody follows the markets, but over the last month or so, all the software as a service companies are running scared because their market values are declining because AI is showing up, and all this. So you have this aligning to a single narrative. Now, I'm going to propose to you that if the single narrative was oriented around reduction of human suffering, I think we could probably all rally around that. The problem is that the single narrative, when you kind of peel back the layers, it always comes back to whose pockets are going to get lined, right? That's problematic for the rest of us, not for the few individuals who are making it. And I don't begrudge anyone for making their money. But look, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I know a hustle when I see a hustle. And that's a hustle, right? That's a grift. And again, you do legal means and all the rest of it, but where it becomes really problematic is when it starts to have real social impact on the rest of us, right? When you tell me that now we need X number of data centers for Y billions of dollars, okay, we can have the where's my tax money going conversation, that's one thing, but we now have to have the conversation about the ecology, right? We now have to have a conversation about or whose neighborhoods are these data centers showing up in, and do those folks actually have a voice? Now we have to talk about political disenfranchisement. Now we got to start thinking about, do people actually have the financial ability to exercise the law, right? So now you got to have a big conversation about justice. So the diffusion creates a lot of other conversations when it all started with, hey, you know what? I got a great idea. We should make, a God in the sky and call it AGI. Look, have at it, but know that that's got to be contained. But this is what lobbying does. It helps, again, no problem with influence. That's the political process. But part of my aim is to create enough awareness so people understand that you are a part of a political process. The train is coming. You have to realize that you have a say, right? So go say something. I don't care where you fall on the spectrum. What I care about is most of us are either unaware or mute. And so we've got to find ways to get more people engaged in the conversation that most of us didn't know that we were even having. That's good questions. My natural inclination is to come from a place of moral clarity. That's not to say that it's right or wrong, good or bad. It's just my natural inclination. So that's where I start. Having said that, part of my provocation is to provoke and get out of the way. So I don't want to define suffering for anyone, but I do know that suffering is common. And so if I can meet another human being and I look at another human being eye to eye and we talk about what suffering is to us, that creates a symbiosis that definitions can't, right? So I know at some point we gotta be able to objectify things so we can encode them in law and all that sort of stuff. But I think what folks are experiencing as I talk to folks is a lot more primal. When we're working on legislation, I think people are like, who cares, man? Seriously, who cares? I want to know, do I have to be concerned about Waymo taking my Uber job? That's what I care about, right? And yeah, maybe, right? Okay, so if I care about that, then I got to figure out how I can put food on the table, because this was my side hustle, because my primary job doesn't pay enough. That's where people are. And so who am I to step in and try to say, here's the definition of suffering. They're like, get out of my face with that. So I'd much rather say suffering and step back. Yeah, invite the accelerationists, because they need to also have a seat at the table, because they are also valuable, right? Pushing us forward into the frontier is a valuable exercise with limits, right? And they need to be in the conversation outside of themselves and looking the Uber drivers in the eye and say, oh, now I get it, right? So I'm kind of counting on them caring, right, to your point. But I don't know another way to force humans to be human. So, Aaron, you gonna say something?
I got one question for you. So you're on a college campus, a lot of kids in school, thinking about their careers, what to major in, what's next.
Yeah.
And over history, jobs become more or less important depending on what's happening. So I know you get this question a lot. So just talk a little bit, whether it's computer science coders, software engineers, AI maybe replace a lot of that stuff. But on the flip, service industries, electricians, HVAC, ditch diggers, AI can't replace everything. So can you speak a little bit to that? You mentioned we've got law students here trying to learn what they may want to do with their careers, how to leverage AI, what industries to go into that may become more or less important in the future. Can you speak to
I will certainly
students a little bit?
I will certainly try. This is always the toughest question because it forces me to prognosticate, which I try to stay out of the forecasting business. However, I think it's informative to look at history, macro and micro response to this question, by the way. So what the accelerationist camp will tell you is, look over history and you'll see that new technology always creates new jobs. Not wrong, right? My grandmother was an operator, switchboard operator back in the day, right? Illinois Bell. And she eventually got disintermediated, as they would say in the corporate space, but lost a job because there was no longer a need for connecting phone calls this way. We ended up developing automated switches to do that. The people who developed automated switches eventually lost jobs because we ended up creating internet and a lot of people started communicating over that. See post office, right? And so for me, the question is not so much did we create new internet jobs as much as it is the pace of change to get to that point and the people, and this is the micro, the people who got caught up along the way. Because on the macro, when you're looking at US government figures, it would suggest, well, GDP is sound, employment is up, right? But what it doesn't say is that Reggie's grandmother in Chicago lost switchboard job, and the new automated switch, the new internet switch job was in Nebraska, was in Los Angeles, right? What it doesn't suggest is that Reggie's grandmother lost a job in, let's say 1960, and it took until 1985 for that to occur, for the new stuff. So what does she do during that? How do you eat for the next 25 years, right? That's an academia issue that we have to contend with, which is how do we get people skilled? Now that becomes a funding issue. How do we, how do we make sure that people have enough dollars in their pocket to be able to pay you to skill them? That's an employer issue, which is, hey, we see something coming down the line and it's probably going to hit your job in 9 months. So rather than me firing you and saying, ta-da, have a good day, here's a little bit of check, why don't I give you a little bit of heads up, right? So that becomes a cultural practice matter. I'm going to answer your question eventually, but hopefully you see that, I can share, hey, here's probably where the next few jobs are, but if they're on the other side of the globe, what does it matter, right? And so I think we have to be realistic about our ability to affect all of these dials that I'm referring to. And then we also have to peer back at the students to say, and this is your question, how do we enable them to be able to identify where the new opportunities are so they can pursue them, right? So on that front, AI is actively creating new jobs. Had you asked me 3 years ago, well, maybe not 3 years, 5 years ago, if I were going to be doing what I'm doing, the answer would be no, because it did not exist, right? So new jobs are being created. I have a whole team of people who are a part of it. Those jobs, many of them did not exist, right? Now, AI is automating a lot of cognition, right? The model providers are selling intelligence. That's the game that they're in. They're literally selling intelligence. And so we used to have to hire people for intelligence in corporate spaces. Do I need to hire people in order to receive intelligence in 2026? The answer is yes, but not as much. So then the next question is, what might I be able to do different that I'm not doing today as a company if I were able to get some human intelligence in the door? Well, Chick-fil-A is in the business of selling chicken. That's kind of their gig. I don't expect them to say, you know what, we're going to expand into pizza, right? We're going to start owning automobiles. Like, at some point, a business does what a business does. And so this story that, we can just expand is, it's not an infinite expansion opportunity, right? And so yes, there will be new jobs that crop up. And I would say to our students, go and find the jobs where you have specific domain intelligence that require you to interface with human beings, right? Because the AI so far has not gotten to the point at which it is convincingly human unto itself. Now, of course, we'll soon be talking about embodied AI. That will be a thing. We're starting to see humanoids pop up and all that. Like, that's real. Don't panic. But at some point, those humanoids will have a place. I'm anticipating you'll see a lot more of that in large-scale manufacturing settings. But in terms of legal community, that might create opportunity for you to, be corporate representation for organizations that are going down that path, right? How do you deal with OSHA in the context of humanoids? I don't know, right? Oh, by the way, as we start dealing with more agentic AI, how do we assign rights? So I think there's space there. What are we gonna do about copyright, right? All these people who have created, artists creating content that's getting swooped up by the models, and we need attorneys there. So I think there are spots, but again, if I were, like, I have a 24-year-old myself, right? I'm like, first, this has been my advice since he's 5 or 6, learn how to read, write, do arithmetic, and talk to people. Right? Start there. But then more precisely from a legal perspective, I would say try not to get into positions, unless this is just your jam, try not to get into positions that allow you to just be heads down on research and analysis, because that will be disintermediated, right? There might still be people who say, yeah, we just want to have a person to hug. Okay. But at some point, the AI does that. Put yourself in positions where you got to take that intelligence and go and do something with it. That would be my advice.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.